Okay, well, let's go ahead and it looks like most of us are here, so let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for being flexible and meeting online today. I appreciate it. We'll just continue with lecture today as we normally would. If you have any questions at any time, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up. That's going to be easier. I will try to keep an eye on the chat as well as the videos, but it's not easy to always monitor that. So don't be afraid to just speak up during lecture at any point if you have questions. In advance of today's class, you had some reading to do in your textbook, continuing with muscles. I'm hoping today that we can wrap up muscles or come very close to it and start in on the skull next week, which is exciting times. I like talking about the skull. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive in. We've got a pretty full and exciting agenda today. I've got a human anatomy in the news segment for you. We'll continue our lecture on muscles. Then you've got a mini quiz in the middle of class, which is something I know many of you have asked me for. You said we want more mini quizzes. Well, today's your day. And then we'll continue with muscles. And then I do have your exam scores to give to you. We'll debrief that exam as a class. And I'll give some details about your upcoming lab practical, as well as some reminders. And we'll end things today. It is Friday with the greatest Venn diagram of all time. And I know I'm building that up, but once you see this Venn diagram, you will understand. So let's dive into it. Let me actually give 1 second before we do. What questions do you have before we jump in here? All right, let's do it. Human anatomy in the news. This is a cool story that came out last fall. I think it's from pretty recently. And what these researchers did is they exercised mice and humans in what's called an eccentric exercise. So an eccentric exercise is when your muscle is being used, but also being stretched at the same time. So a good example of when you do this is running downhill. Anyone that's ever run downhill knows kind of how difficult it is and how sore your legs get afterwards. And that's because this kind of exercise damages the membrane around sarcomeres. And what this research found is they did some imaging, and you can see an example of it here. It's pretty incredible. You can see this is skeletal muscle, so it's striated. You see those bands. Those are the light and dark lines in each sarcomere, so that identifies it as skeletal muscle. Just a little refresher for your histology section for your lab practical. And these circular purple bodies here are actually cell nuclei. So remember, your skeletal muscle is multinucleated. And what they found was that these nuclei actually migrate to the damaged site. So remember, nuclei are where the DNA is stored. And of course, DNA is the first step in producing proteins. You need to translate that DNA into mRNA and then transcribe proteins. And so these nuclei move to the damaged site so that proteins can produce quickly to address this damage. And they found that this happened really quickly. So within hours after exercise, these nuclei migrated, and within like a day of exercise, the healing was complete. So really kind of fits with what we expected about muscle damage, but confirms it through this imaging and also provides some just incredible images of what that looks like at a microscopic scale. One other important piece that they found, and I thought this was interesting, is that training reduced the amount of damage. So mice that had been trained running downhill over a period of time and then were run downhill for the experiment experienced less damage than those mice that had just run downhill for the first time. And this fits with what you've all probably experienced. Let's say that you're laid up for a while and can't exercise, and all of a sudden you get back to the gym or you go out for a run. That next day you're pretty sore, but that level of soreness generally decreases with the more active you are. And that is the reason is because your cells are more robust to this kind of damage, among other things. So very cool. I have a link to the Popular Science article about this in your class program for Monday. It's about a 5-minute read. And remember, you can expect some questions on human anatomy in the news on your upcoming quizzes and exams. So cool story. I wanted to share that one with you. And while we're talking about skeletal muscle, I want to refresh your memory that skeletal muscle is often referred to as voluntary muscle. But there are limitations on what you can do with voluntary movements because of the way these muscles are linked and because of the way the different attachments are linked. So a great example of this is actually just using your fingers here. And you can all do this experiment at home. Actually, I have a little clip right here I'm going to grab to do this. Where did I put that little clip? Here we go. So what you can do with this is I want you to take your index finger and your forefinger, and I want you to squeeze, and you can just squeeze them together just like this. I have a little clip here. I'm going to squeeze this. Now, as you're doing that, try and get your other three fingers, so these three fingers, to relax. And you'll see that you can't really do that. If I'm squeezing with these, my thumb and my forefinger, these fingers are tense. Now I can move them around. They can be down here, they can be up here. But if I'm exerting any force here, these muscles are going to contract. And that is because of the way these muscles are linked to move the different fingers, and that you need to have certain muscles contracted to provide stabilization so that you can apply force between your pinky and your thumb. So even though these muscles are voluntary muscles and we can move them as we like, there are limits to that. And this is one example of that. So as we try to understand these different movements that we can produce, I want to move in and talk about the roles of muscles. So there are four primary roles of muscle during a movement. And what's important to note here is that these roles change all the time depending on what we're doing. We talked in class on Wednesday about how what we define as the insertion or origin it depends on what kind of movement is being produced. Although generally, just to refresh your memory, the origin is going to be more medial or proximal to the body, and the insertion is going to be further away. So for example, your biceps brachii has its origin up here on your humerus, and its insertion is down here in the antebrachium. Now, as you move your body through space, muscles can take on different roles. And there's four major categories. The first is what we call the prime mover or the agonist. The second is the antagonist. The third is a fixator. And the fourth is a synergist. And we're going to walk through each of these and give examples in our upcoming slides. So four major categories. Oh, that was three. Four major categories: prime mover, antagonist, fixator, synergist. So let's talk about the prime mover or the agonist first. This is, as you might guess, the muscle that is providing most of the force to provide the action. So a good example is the flexors of your digits and your pollex when you clench your fist. So you've got these muscles in your forearm here that contract when you move your fist like this, or your pectoralis major muscle when you're flexing your arm at the shoulder like this. Those are the muscles that are doing the bulk of the heavy lifting. As you might guess, the muscle on the opposite side of that is referred to as the antagonist. So this is a muscle that opposes that movement. So again, going back to the shoulder, I'm flexing my arm at the shoulder, so I'm moving my arm forward like this. That pectoralis major is the agonist, but the antagonist is going to be, in this case, the latissimus dorsi. These are the muscles that need to relax so that I can make this movement possible. Another good example, of course, is flexing at the elbow. The biceps brachii and the brachialis are the agonists here, and then the triceps brachii is going to be the antagonist. Now, the antagonist, it sounds like it's kind of fighting against the agonist, right? But what I want to emphasize here is that they actually are working together, and that in the sense that the antagonist has to relax so that your agonist can provide that movement. If that antagonist doesn't relax, well, then you're not going to move at all, or movement is going to be very difficult. So another kind of demonstration of this is that the extensors of your pollex and digits, so these are the muscles that are responsible for extending your fingers like this, also are simultaneously they're antagonists to those muscles when you're making a fist. And this basically results in this phenomenon. It's a little hard for me to demonstrate here, but if you lay your wrist over the edge of a table and you try to flex those digits as you're making a fist, you kind of can't do it. So you can't, I'm not going to demonstrate well. If I put this on the edge of a table as a fist and I move my wrist down and let it relax, I can't have my wrist relaxed and keep a fist at the same time. You can try that at home. And I'll do a demonstration with this maybe on Monday in the classroom when I can show it a little better. And the reason for that is because the muscles that need to relax to provide this movement are also the muscles that need to contract to make your fist. And so you can't have both of those things happen at the same time. So the role of those muscles, as I mentioned, can shift in different movements, but because of that, it can also limit certain movements that you're able to do with your body. So those are the two kind of main muscles that are involved with a movement, the agonist and the antagonist. We also have something called a fixator. A fixator holds things in place so that you can move other parts of your body. So a great example is if you lay on your back, I'm not going to demonstrate this, don't worry, and you raise your legs, right? In this case, the rectus abdominis, these muscles in your abdomen, they anchor your abdomen so that you can provide the movement in your legs. So even though the major movement is with your leg muscles, the rectus abdominis, so right in here, are stabilizing things or fixing things so that the other movement can happen. They basically provide an anchor so that the other movement is possible. And if those muscles don't flex, then you can't do that movement because you won't be able to provide the stability to lift those legs up. So that's an example of a fixator. The final muscle role is something called a synergist, which, as you might guess based on the name, essentially helps by adding extra force or stabilizing that movement to make it more graceful or more precise. So a good example of this is that the extensors of your wrist are synergists for making a fist. So that's the demonstration we just gave. The muscles that are responsible for doing this are also involved with making a fist. When you're adducting at your shoulder, so if you're moving your arm out, right? The latissimus dorsi, excuse me, if I'm adducting its shoulder, so moving my arm back towards my body, both the pectoralis major and the latissimus dorsi are acting together to pull my arm in. So this is a good example. If I flex at the shoulder like this, pectoralis major is the agonist, latissimus dorsi as the antagonist. But if I adduct my muscle down here, they're acting together, in which case they're acting synergistically, or they're the synergist. Another example of a synergist is that when you're abducting the thumb, so when you're moving your thumb up, the abductor pollicis longus is the agonist. That's the muscle that's providing that, I'm trying to do a good way here, providing that movement, right? And in this case, two other muscles, the extensor carpi ulnaris and the flexor carpi ulnaris, are synergists. They're kind of helping at that movement by stabilizing the wrists and assisting in making that movement happening. Now, I don't need you to know the details of those forearm muscles yet. We're going to talk about the muscles of the upper limb in more detail in our first lab back after spring break. Just want to give some example of synergists in movement. And so the thumb is a good example too, because you can do a lot with your thumb. And the takeaway here is depending on what you're doing, these different muscles can act as synergists or agonists or antagonists. Again, we don't need to know these specific muscles of the forearm just yet, only know that their role changes depending on what you're doing with your thumb. And the thumb is just such a good example because you can do all these crazy things with it. Remember, you have that nice saddle joint down here that allows that range of motion in a couple different directions. So the takeaway message here is that muscles tend to operate at least in pairs, if not involving larger sets of muscles. And what's important to note anatomically is that the muscles that act with opposite actions, so your antagonist and your agonist, are on opposite sides of a joint. And I want to give you some examples of that and talk about that in a little more detail here. But let me catch my breath and let you catch your breath and see what questions you have before we give some examples of these pairs across the body. Okay. Well, let's give some examples of that here. Let me just adjust my screen. Okay, so I said that the muscles that act to as the agonist and the antagonist in a given movement are generally on different sides of the joint, and that's a really important concept. And I gave an example here of flexion at the shoulder. In this case, the pectoralis major, that's the agonist when I flex at the shoulder, is in the front of that joint. It's in the front of the body, whereas the latissimus dorsi, the antagonist, is in the dorsal aspect, is dorsal to that joint. And we see other examples of that here. And what I want to do here is make the connection between the position of the muscle and the kind of motion it produces. So muscles that are on the anterior side of a joint generally produce flexion. So your pectoralis major flexes at the shoulder, your biceps brachii flexes at the elbow, whereas those muscles on the posterior side produce extension. Latissimus dorsi allows me to extend at the elbow. The triceps brachii down here allows extension at the elbow. Excuse me, latissimus dorsi provides extension at the shoulder, triceps brachii extension at the elbow, and those are on the posterior side of the joint. Note that this is flipped over in the legs, so this is true in your torso and your upper limbs, as well as in your neck, for example. Contracting the muscles here provides flexion, contracting the muscles back here, extension. But when we talk about the lower limb, this is flipped around backwards because that lower limb rotates during development. And this came up earlier as well. I just want to re-emphasize that this rule that muscles on the anterior side produce flexion, muscles on the posterior side produce extension, applies everywhere but your legs where it's flipped. So just keep that in mind. Additionally, if we think about motion in other planes, we know that muscles on the lateral side of a joint produce abduction, whereas those that are on the medial side of the joint produce adduction. So a good example of this is when I abduct my shoulder, when I bring it up like this deltoid muscle that's on the lateral side of the joint, it's on the outside of the humerus here, produces that movement, and the muscle on the medial side of the joint produces adduction. In this case, we'll talk about the teres major, which is this muscle that runs from the posterior end of your scapula to the proximal end of your humerus. You can see it on the slide here. It's an important muscle for adduction at the shoulder. And in this case, that muscle is on the medial side of the joint. It's medial to the shoulder and to the humerus specifically. So just a couple of rules to take away as you're thinking about what's an agonist, what's an antagonist, and what kind of motion we're producing. Again, bringing back a lot of this vocabulary that we started off the course with, talking about flexion, extension, adduction, abduction across the different planes of motion. That's all I want to say about that for now. Let me pause and see what questions you have before you get to take your mini quiz. All right, we've got a mini quiz here. This is going to be a short review on some of the concepts we covered in class on Monday. Let me get to it here. I will post, you've got a QR code. I'll also post the link in the chat here to make it a little bit easier, I think. Sorry, I can't do that. Let me get this for you. Okay, I'll post the link in the chat. There you go. And what this is a quiz to identify the muscle shape for each of the following muscles. So it's a 7-question quiz. It's worth 2 points for completion. I'm not going to grade you on this, just provide some useful information for you and for me about what concepts you're understanding from these muscle shapes that we covered on Monday. So you've got 2 minutes, go ahead and do that, and then we can debrief and continue. There we go. All right, I look forward to seeing those. Those of you that might be watching the class later on video, you can complete that as well. So here's the answer key we have from our work on Monday. We can see that one was the parallel shape, and those are long strap-like muscles, for example, the sartorius. So remember, the parallel can take a couple different shapes. In this case, it's strap-like. We also have convergent. Number two is the pectoralis major. Number three is circular. That one's pretty obvious, orbicularis oris. Then we have a multipennate muscle for number four, a unipennate muscle for number five, and a bipennate for number seven. Remember, for those pennate muscles, the muscle fibers are running at oblique angles to a tendon that runs along the muscle, and the number of kind of directions from which they're branching off that tendon determine if it's unipennate, bipennate, or multipennate. And then finally, number six, remember that parallel muscles can be either strap-like, like your sartorius in number one, or fusiform, like your biceps brachii, number six. Fusiform just means they have this fatter belly in the middle of the muscle. And actually, belly is the term we use for that portion of the muscle. So just a quick review, get you thinking about that a little bit, and help both of you and I kind of know what concepts are sticking and what we need to work on. I'm going to now transition, and this is the last aspect of what I want to talk about with our muscles. And this has to do with how we name the skeletal muscles. My hope here is that I'm going to provide some examples and give some reasons why muscles have the names that they have. And this is going to help you memorize a lot of these muscles in lab. We don't focus on our lecture content focuses mostly on understanding how we characterize muscles and categorize them and their functions in different contexts. The lab portion of the lab focuses more on memorizing what muscles this, what muscles this, what muscles this. So I'm hoping that this helps you memorize some of those muscles. So we name muscles, first of all, by their shape. So for example, is the deltoid, which is triangular in shape, looks like the Greek letter delta. We name muscles by their size. So you're familiar with muscles that are the maximus, the minimus, the longus. So a good example would be your gluteus maximus and your gluteus minimus. We also name them by the number of origins that they have, for example, in terms, so we name them after their structure, for example, the number of origins. So biceps, triceps, quadriceps, that refers to the number of attachment points at the origin of a muscle. Biceps brachii here, but remember you also have a biceps femoris. You have triceps brachii here, quadriceps in the anterior portion of your upper leg. And then we also have muscle names based on where they are. So the brachialis is located in the brachium. So that's up here, kind of working synergistically with your bicep. And so given that if we know that muscles are generally named after their shape, their size, their structure, and location, that can help us remember some of the names. We also have muscles named based on their attachments. So for example, the brachioradialis, that has its insertion up here on the brachium, and its its origin up here on the brachium and its insertion down there on the radius, brachioradialis. And sometimes we name them after the type of motion that they produce. So we have flexors, extensors, adductors, abductors, etc. For example, in your lab last week, you saw the adductor group in the kind of upper inner thigh of your cat. That's a group of muscles that are responsible for adducting the leg. And finally, we often name muscles after the shape of and direction of those fascicles and muscle fibers. This kind of ties into the mini quiz you just took. A good example is the rectus abdominis and the transversus abdominis. So the rectus abdominis run up and down, kind of parallel. They're parallel and up and down, whereas the transverse abdominis run across in the opposite direction, perpendicular to the rectus abdominis. We also have obliques, which run at an angle that is neither vertical nor horizontal. They're at this angle like this. So all of those things together, we can get a good idea of what muscles are named for. So let's talk about the deltoid muscles. This is a triangle. So if you're looking at someone from a superior aspect, looking down on them, these look like triangles. And so they're named after the Greek letter delta, which is triangular in shape. We also have the trapezius, which looks like a big trapezoid. And you see this is a large muscle on the back here. It's got its origin along this aponeurosis across from basically extending from your skull down to just about your lumbar vertebrae, and the muscle extends out with its insertions on your scapula there, and it's shaped like a giant kite, basically, a trapezoidal shape. We also have muscles that have like a sawtooth shape, like the serratus muscles of your lateral lateral thoracic area, your thoracic region, sorry. And this has the sawtooth shape like a serrated knife, for example. We have examples of rectus muscles. These are like the rectus abdominis. And we have a small muscle here called the pyramidalis. And this has this pyramid shape. We also have muscles that are named relative to their size. So we have pectoralis major and pectoralis minor in our chest, pectoralis major being bigger, as you might guess, even though they act synergistically, one is bigger than the other, hence major and minor. We name muscles after their structure, so how many heads they have, for example. So your triceps brachii has 3 heads, the biceps brachii has 2 attachment points. You see here on the clavicle, excuse me, not on the clavicle, on the scapula. Moving through this pretty quickly, again, my idea here is just to kind of give some examples of muscles that are named after these different aspects, so you can bring this back to what you find in lab. Muscles are also named after their position. So we have the frontalis, which is this muscle here just superior to the eyes and anterior to your cranium. We have the infraspinatus, which is a muscle that is here. It's kind of on the dorsal aspect of your scapula, just below that spine. Remember, infra meaning below. We have the subscapularis, which is the muscle on the anterior aspect of the scapula. So it's kind of deep to the scapula if you're looking from the back. And so that's called the subscapularis. Pectoralis major I just talked about because it's in the pectoral region of the body. Pectoralis minor, of course, also named for being in the pectoral region of the body. Then we can get into some more, and these are muscles that I'm not really going to focus on in class. As I mentioned, there's hundreds and hundreds of muscles in your body. We're not going to learn them all. But I do want you to know, for example, the coracobrachialis is a muscle that has its origin on the coracoid process of the scapula and its insertion on the brachium, hence coracobrachialis. The pectineus, so arises on this pectineal surface of the ramus of the pubis on your coxal bone. So another example there. Again, muscles that we're not going to get in much detail with. I'm just giving examples of how they're named. Let's see, what else do I want to talk about here? Let's talk about a few more examples of this. Let me just see what I have. Yeah, I've got a handful more examples. I'll just keep walking through these. But before I do, let me just pause and see if you have any questions. Just a lot of examples here. You know, I'll be honest with the classes that every year I give this part of this lecture, and I think to myself, I need to present this a little bit differently next year, and then I haven't this year. So what would be ideal if I had an activity planned around these instead of just giving examples here in class? But I don't have that, so we're just going to walk through a few more examples, and we can get to some activities next week. We name muscles after their attachments, so the intercostals. The external intercostals and the internal intercostals are between the ribs. So intercostal means between ribs, and we have those on the outside and on the inside. We also have muscles named after what they do. So the levator scapulae has its origin here up on the cervical vertebrae, and its insertion down here in the scapula, and actually is what one of the muscles you use when you like bring your shoulder, shrug your shoulders, for example, to levate, to raise something up is to levitate it, hence levator scapulae. We've got a couple muscles that articulate your fingers and your thumb, your digits, and so the flexor digitorum profundus and flexor pollicis longus. So they flex the digits and they're deep. The muscle flex digits and it's deep to other muscles, or a muscle that flexes your thumb and is long compared to other flexors. And finally, we see kind of funny names sometimes. So sartorius is actually named after comes from the Latin word for tailor. And it's thought that this name, so because tailors would sit kind of cross-legged here. And so that's kind of the muscle that runs across your inner thigh as you're sitting with your legs crossed. I mentioned also that the direction of the fibers is important. So thinking about external and internal obliques versus transverse versus your rectus abdominis. And you can see that that's from a salamander. Let me show you an example in a human. So the muscles of your abdomen are run in different directions to provide stability in different directions. This is a good example of how these muscles can act together to provide a great range of motion. So your rectus abdominis move here. When these guys contract, it provides flexion at the waist and the abdomen. Then you have the transverse abdominis. When these guys contract, like if you flex your stomach, these guys contract to provide stability in the other direction. And then you have your obliques, which run basically at a 45-degree angle to those two. And again, they provide stability in yet another direction. So these muscles are all working together to provide support at the torso in these different directions. And this, of course, is super important when you're running, especially if you're kind of twisting and turning and jumping. You need to have that support in all different dimensions. And let me see, I've got a few more here. I think I've talked about most of these actually. I'm just flipping through my slides to see how much more I want to cover this and what time it is. Okay, I've got a few more to cover here. This actually timing could work out pretty well. Another example of muscles named after their position is the gastrocnemius. So that comes from the word for stomach and leg because it's got this big belly. It kind of bulges out the back of the leg. Kind of a funny name for a muscle. Latissimus dorsi refers to, latissimus means like the biggest, flattest muscle, and dorsi refers to the back. So it's this huge muscle right here. Then, of course, we have muscles that are involved in rotation of the limbs. And so these are named your pronators and your supinators. We saw some examples of that, like the pronator teres I gave an example of in class the other day. You can see these are involved with the twisting of the muscles here. And someone asked me in class what the antagonist was to the pronator. And this is, I wanted to highlight this, the example, and I should have known this off the top of my head, is in fact the supinator. You can see the supinator runs here from the condyle, the epicondyle, excuse me, of the humerus down onto your ulna here and helps pull that muscle. Your arm moves your forearm back this way. So your pronator is going to turn your arm this way, and your supinator is going to turn it this way. Phew! And let's see here. We have some muscles involved with the rotation of the humerus. We have the muscles of the rotator cuff. Those of you that play baseball or follow baseball have probably heard of pitchers getting rotator cuff injuries. The rotator cuff is this set of four muscles that have their insertions on the proximal end of the humerus. And that includes the infraspinatus, the teres minor, the supraspinatus, which you don't see here, and the subscapularis. And then we also have the teres major, which is technically not part of the rotator cuff, but is still involved with the rotating the humerus there. And so these muscles are named after their position, and they're all involved with rotating the humerus, which, of course, if you're a baseball pitcher, is really important every time you throw that ball. Let's see, we talked about the vastus muscles in lab, the lateralis, intermedius, and medialis in terms of they're three of the four muscles of the quadriceps. And what I want you to take away here, no, I don't need to get into that. I think we've been talking about muscles running across multiple joints and the motions they provide. I feel like we've covered that amply. So I don't need to get into that right now. I think we've covered that. All right. That's a little bit of a whirlwind. I totally recognize that. Again, my point here is just to expose you to some of these different names. Hopefully this will kind of help you make some connections as you're memorizing the names of these muscles for your lab. And so actually with that in mind, let me pause and see what questions you have, and then I'm going to talk about your upcoming lab practical. Any questions? All right, so your question in the chat. Let's see, is the sartorial a hip flexor muscle? Okay, great question. So the sartorius, rather, is does provide, so it moves across the entire upper leg. And what that does is it can provide rotation in certain contexts at the waist, but also can provide flexion at the hip. Yeah, so it's one of the muscles involved with that. It's not the only one, but it is a synergist in that movement. That is all we're going to cover for muscles in lecture. I'm going to transition on Monday. We're going to start talking about the skull, and that will take us through to spring break. And then after spring break, we'll get into muscles of the upper limbs in your cat dissection, and then we'll get into the skull in the subsequent lab. So that's all we'll do for muscles. With that in mind, I want to talk about your lab practical schedule. So your lab practical, as you know, is Tuesday. The lab will be open through Tuesday morning for studying. Tuesday morning, it will be locked. So this is important to know. If, for example, if you're in the afternoon lab, please don't expect to come in the lab in the morning to brush up before your practical. If you're in the morning lab, we will start our practical at 10:30 a.m. I'm designing it to take about an hour. This gives you an hour and a half. If you need to go over that, that's fine. There's no time limit for the practical. What this allows me to do is keep the lab open through Monday night, and then I can set things up early on Tuesday for your lab. So we're not starting until 10:30. Also might provide you an opportunity to sleep in, which nobody complains about. If you're in the afternoon lab, there's two different starting times, and I just randomly assigned you to one of these two times. Half of the class is starting at 1:10, half at 2:30. The reason for this is the afternoon lab is substantially larger, and this makes it easier as you're moving around the stations to give each other time and space to do your best work. So there's the list of names for who should start at 1:10 and who should start at 2:30. Again, the lab is designed to take, the practical is designed to take about an hour. This gives you an hour and a half to do it, and if you need extra time, that is perfectly fine as well. Generally, I've found that it's been not an issue for students. The questions in the lab practical will be the same format you saw in the quizzes. It's closed book and closed note, and I'm basically going to give you body parts, ask you to name them, ask you to name different features on them, and ask you to know where they are. I just got a message. Olivia, Olivia, you're in the afternoon lab, and you're not on the list. I guess you're off the hook. I'm just kidding. Actually, Olivia, I apologize for that. Will you go to the 2:30 section then? Because that's where we have less people. I'm not sure why that happened, but I am sorry about it. So Olivia will be in the afternoon. I'll add her on there. And also, yeah, it's closed book and closed note. And you can expect stations. We'll do the QR code thing again. You answer questions from a drop-down menu or some open-ended short answer questions. Any questions about the lab practical? All right, well, let's move. I have a couple other announcements here and I want to remind you that you're going to see the world's greatest Venn diagram at the end of this class as well. So stay with me for a few more minutes here. I want to make sure we get this. Let's talk about your exam. So exam scores will be open in Blackboard immediately following class. Here is a histogram of the results. Again, the x-axis here shows the grades for different students in the class, and the y-axis here is the frequency. So in other words, I think 13 of you, which is pretty much half the class, got a score between 95 and 100, and so on. So scores are really high on this exam. The class average was a 93 overall. I think with open book questions, this generally is the case. I tried to make it a bit more challenging with some of the open-ended questions. Most of you just got full credit. Almost everybody in the class got full credit for the drawing question. Did a great job with that. A few of you forgot to label a couple of things. Most of you did lose some points on the last question, comparing shoulder and pelvic girdles. I gave detailed feedback for why you lost points for each of you individually. And there's also example answers for both questions available in Blackboard under your quizzes and exams folder. So you can see that. You can see where you lost points. I explained why you lost points in the comments or the feedback. And of course, if you have questions, just let me know. So overall, great job in the class. I think that having the test open book definitely helps improve grades. Having said that, remember that your lab practical is a different format. And historically, I've found that the lab practicals are the toughest part of this class, basically. That's where the class average is the lowest. There's a lot to memorize. And to help you with that, there is a study guide available in Blackboard for your lab practical. Also, Chase is going to be in the lab room on Sunday from 12 to 2. to host a review session. She's great, can help you walk through details that are in the lab practical. I'll, of course, have my open hours on Monday as well if you have any questions. Finally, I want to remind you that a week from today, we won't have class in the classroom. Instead, you'll be taking lecture quiz number 3, which will be open all day online. You can see some details about that in your class program for Monday. Also note your class program for Monday has a 2-point class survey to reflect on your current grade in the class. So I'm going to open up after class the grades for exam 1 is also your overall, your current standing in class as well. So you can see what your percentage and your letter grade is in the class so far. And yes, I see a question in the chat here. Use the learning outcomes are essential for your lab as well. What I would do is pair those with the specifics I provided in the study guide to make sure all of that is making sense. Remember, if you have questions, I have open hours on Monday from noon to 2. I'll be in the lab room, and all the specimens will be out as well. It's a great time to study. And before I give you the greatest Venn diagram of all time, any questions about anything? Anything else? I see a question in the chat. Will we be able to look at the cat? Yeah, you can pull the cat out whenever you want. Take a look at it. That's fine with me. Just make sure you bag it up and put it away following the procedures we followed in lab. So absolutely. And you can expect at least 1, if not 2 stations on your lab practical to have a cat out, a pin and a muscle. I'll ask you what muscle that is. All right. Here's your Venn diagram. There's no ticket out today. I'll let you look at this. I will stop recording, but I will stay online on Zoom for a few minutes here if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, have a great weekend. Good luck preparing for your practical, and I look forward to seeing everyone back in person and lecture on Monday. Thank you.